wind howled through the skeletal trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something foul, ancient, and decayed. A thick mist slithered across the ground, wrapping around the gnarled roots of twisted oaks like ghostly fingers. The moon, swollen and red as a festering wound, loomed over the sky, casting its eerie glow upon the abandoned ruins that lay ahead. Rayan clutched the lantern tightly, its feeble flame dancing against the gusty wind. His breath came in short, visible puffs as he walked forward, the crunch of dead leaves beneath his boots the only sound disturbing the oppressive silence. Behind him, his companions followed hesitantly. Jamal, Mansour, Wasim, Ihsan, Dunya, Tahira, Lena, and Sumaya, each of them wearing the same expression of unease. "This place feels wrong," Dunya murmured, hugging herself as she peered into the darkness ahead. "Because it is," Jamal muttered. No one has set foot here in centuries for a reason. They had all heard the legends, stories passed down in hushed whispers, warnings of the forgotten realm, a place untouched by time, abandoned by life, and claimed by the dead. But the lure of its secrets had been too strong to resist. Rumors of a hidden temple, an ancient artifact, and the truth behind the bloodied moon had led them here. And now, standing at the threshold of the forsaken land, they all felt it, an unspoken dread slithering into their bones, as though something unseen was watching, waiting. The ruins stretched before them, remnants of a civilization lost to time. Broken archways loomed like the ribs of some colossal beast, and stone pillars stood cracked and weathered, their surfaces engraved with symbols none of them could recognize. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment, damp moss, and something else, something metallic. Blood. Sumaya gasped, pointing toward the ground. "Look!" Dark stains marred the stones, trailing into the shadows beyond. The sight sent a ripple of fear through the group. "We should turn back," Lena said, her voice trembling. Wasim scoffed. "After coming this far? No chance." Rayan swallowed hard, forcing down his unease. "We keep going. Stay close and don't touch anything." They ventured deeper, weaving through the ruins until they came upon a massive stone doorway, its surface covered in intricate carvings. The entrance stood ajar, revealing a yawning abyss within. A low, rhythmic sound pulsed from the darkness, like a heartbeat echoing through the void. Ihsan hesitated. "Does anyone else hear that?" Before anyone could answer, the wind picked up, carrying with it a sound that turned their blood to ice. Whispers. Distant at first, then growing closer, filling the air around them. Words they couldn't understand, spoken in voices that sounded hollow, broken, and filled with sorrow. Dunya whimpered. "Something's here." Rayan stepped forward, his lantern trembling in his grasp. He peered into the doorway, his heart hammering against his ribs. The shadows seemed to shift, writhing like living things. And then, from within the darkness, something moved. A figure emerged, a tall, gaunt shape draped in tattered robes. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but its eyes burned with a crimson glow, twin embers flickering in the abyss. A deep, rattling breath escaped the figure, and with it came a voice that didn't belong to the living. "You should not have come." The group froze. A suffocating silence followed, pressing down on them like a heavy weight. Then, in an instant, the figure lunged. A piercing shriek tore through the air as the lantern was knocked from Rayan's hands, its flame extinguished upon impact. Darkness swallowed them whole. Panic erupted. Dunya screamed. Mansour stumbled backward. Someone tripped over the rubble, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The whispers became a deafening chorus, 1,000 voices crying out in agony, warning, cursing. Rayan fumbled for his flashlight, his hands shaking. He flicked it on just in time to see the figure standing over Jamal, skeletal fingers reaching for his throat. Without thinking, Rayon grabbed a broken piece of stone and hurled it. The projectile passed through the figure as though it were nothing more than smoke. And yet, it turned, its glowing eyes now locked onto him. Then, it spoke again, not with words, but with a sound that reached into Rayon's very soul. A memory flashed before his eyes. A temple bathed in blood. A moon, red and full, hanging over a field of lifeless bodies. And a name that did not belong to him, but one he somehow knew. Ereshkigal. His vision blurred. Pain exploded behind his eyes and the world tilted. A sharp, ice-cold grip closed around his wrist. And then, silence. The whispers stopped. The wind ceased. The ruins stood still, as though frozen in time. Rayon gasped for breath, finding himself sprawled on the ground. The others were around him, pale, shaking, eyes wide with terror. The figure was gone. Jamal clutched his throat, his breathing ragged. Dunya sobbed quietly, her hands covering her face. Sumaya was the first to speak. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "We need to leave, now." But as they turned back toward the path they had come from, a chilling realization struck them. The doorway they had entered through, it was gone, sealed. They were trapped. And as the bloodied moon hung high above them, casting its crimson light upon the ruins, Rayon knew one thing for certain. They had awakened something that should have been left undisturbed. The realization struck them like a hammer to the chest. The path they had entered through, the one leading back to the safety of the forest, was gone. In its place stood an unbroken wall of ancient stone, its surface worn and cracked with age. The air felt heavier, as if the very ruins themselves were pressing down on them, whispering their doom. Rayon ran to where the entrance had been, his hands frantically searching the cold stone for any sign of an opening. No, no, no. This isn't possible. His fingers scraped against the rough surface, but there was nothing. Jamal turned, his voice hoarse. "It was just here. We walked through it minutes ago." Dunya whimpered, backing away. "We're trapped." The group fell into stunned silence, their eyes darting around, searching for another way out. The ruins stretched endlessly in all directions, a maze of ancient corridors and crumbling archways. The bloodstains on the ground seemed darker now, fresher, as if the stone had been bleeding for centuries. Wasim exhaled sharply, his voice tight with barely contained panic. "There has to be another way. We just need to..." A low, groaning sound rumbled through the air, like a beast stirring from slumber. The ground beneath them trembled. Dust rained down from above as deep within the ruins. Something shifted. It was as if the ruins were breathing. Sumaya clutched Tahira's arm, her eyes wide with terror. "Did you hear that?" Ehsan nodded slowly. "We're not alone." Rayan forced himself to breathe. Panic wouldn't help them now. "We need to move," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. "Standing here won't get us out. If there's no way back, we go forward." The others hesitated, but they knew there was no other choice. They stepped cautiously through the ruins, their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The wind had died, leaving behind an unnatural silence. Every sound they made felt too loud, as if something was listening, waiting. They followed a narrow passageway that twisted through the ruins. Strange symbols covered the walls, etched deep into the stone, their meaning lost to time. Some of the carvings resembled human figures, their faces contorted in expressions of agony. Others depicted the moon, always red, always full. Dunya ran a trembling hand over one of the engravings. "These people, they look like they were screaming." Jamal frowned, his gaze locked on the image of the moon. "This same symbol has appeared everywhere we've been. What does it mean?" Before anyone could answer, the whispering began again. It was faint at first, like a breeze through dead leaves. But as they moved deeper into the corridor, the voices grew louder, hollow, desperate, pleading. Rayyan shivered. It's the same voices from before. Lena turned her head sharply. Where are they coming from? As if in response, the walls shifted. The stone cracked, revealing deep, hollow sockets. Eyes, hundreds of them, peering out from within the walls. Empty, lifeless, yet somehow watching. Tahira screamed, stumbling backward. Oh my God! Ehsan grabbed her before she could fall. Don't touch the walls! The whispering intensified, turning into agonized moans. The eyes blinked, their movements jerky and unnatural. Then, from the darkness ahead, footsteps. Heavy, measured, coming closer. Rayyan raised his flashlight, his heart pounding. Who's there? No response, only the rhythmic thud of approaching footsteps. Then, a voice, low, gravelly, inhuman. You do not belong here. A figure emerged from the shadows. The Watcher. It was tall, draped in a tattered, blackened cloak that trailed across the stone floor. Its face was obscured beneath a deep hood, but within the darkness, two burning red eyes stared out. Its bony fingers twitched at its sides, and as it took another step forward, the air around them turned cold, a seeping, unnatural cold that crept beneath their skin, into their bones. Lena gasped, backing away. What the hell is that? The Watcher tilted its head, as if studying them. Then, in a voice layered with 1,000 whispers, it spoke again. The bloodied moon has risen. You should not have come. Rayyan swallowed hard, forcing himself to stand his ground. We didn't mean to disturb anything. We just... The Watcher moved too fast. One moment it was standing still. The next it was inches away from him, its presence suffocating, its breath like frozen air against his skin. Your blood will feed the stone. The ruins trembled. The eyes in the walls wept black tears, and the whispering turned to screams. The Watcher raised its hand, skeletal fingers reaching for Rayyan's throat. And then, Jamal lunged. With a desperate yell, he swung the crowbar he had been holding. The metal pierced right through the Watcher's form as if hitting smoke. But for just a moment, the creature flickered, its outline rippling like the reflection in disturbed water. It let out a hiss, a sound like shattering glass, and vanished. The ruins grew quiet. Jamal panted, clenching the crowbar. Did that work? Sumaya shook her head. I don't think it's gone. Rayyan steadied himself, trying to calm the racing of his heart. He turned to the others. We have to keep moving. They hurried deeper into the ruins, the Watcher's presence still lingering in the air like the aftermath of a nightmare. Finally, they reached a door. Massive, ancient, its surface covered in the same eerie symbols they had seen before. But this one was different. At its center was a single handprint, smeared in something dark. Blood. Dunya paled. I don't want to know whose hand that belongs to. Ehsan hesitated. It might be the only way out. Rayyan clenched his jaw. Then let's open it. He reached out and pressed his palm against the cold stone. The moment his skin touched the surface, the ruins came alive. The whispering returned, louder than before. The walls shook, sending dust cascading from the ceiling. The ground beneath them cracked, as if something was trying to break free. Then, from the darkness behind them, a voice full of malice. You should not have touched the door. Rayyan turned just in time to see the Watcher reappear, its eyes burning brighter than ever. And then, the door swung open. Beyond it lay nothing but blackness. Before anyone could react, the ground gave way, and the group plunged into the void. Their screams echoed as they fell, swallowed by the darkness. They fell, down into an endless void, the darkness swallowing them whole. The ruins above vanished, consumed by shadows, and the air howled around them like 1,000 tortured souls. The fall felt eternal, weightless, disorienting, as if time itself had lost meaning. The whispering from the walls had followed them, growing into an eerie, agonized chorus. Then, without warning, impact. The world slammed into them, the force sending pain ripping through their bodies. The ground beneath them was cold and damp, but they were alive. Groaning, they pushed themselves up, their breaths ragged. Rayon coughed, tasting dust and something metallic. Blood. He wasn't sure if it was his. His flashlight flickered as he reached for it, revealing their surroundings. They were in a cavern. The ceiling loomed high above, jagged like the ribs of some long-dead beast. Black stone walls surrounded them, glistening with moisture, and the floor was uneven, scattered with ancient bones and remnants of something far more sinister. Jamal groaned, rubbing his shoulder. "Is everyone okay?" Dunya whimpered, holding her ankle. "I think I twisted it." Ihsan helped her sit up. "We need to be careful. We don't know what's down here." Wasim lifted his head, his voice shaky. "Where is here?" As if in response, a sound echoed from the depths of the cavern. A distant scraping, slow and deliberate. Something was moving. Lena clutched her arms. "We need to get out of here. Now." Rayon nodded, scanning the cavern. His flashlight beam landed on a passageway, a narrow tunnel carved into the rock, disappearing into the darkness beyond. "That's our way forward." "And what if it goes down that way worse?" Rayon leveled his gaze at her, voice low. "Then we face it." They had no choice. They moved with care, over broken bones and shredded pottery like shards older than history itself. The air was damp, stinking of rot, and the walls carried the same mystifying symbols etched deeply into the stone they'd seen before. Only now, they were glowing. A dull, pulsating red light oozed from the carvings, as if the stone itself was bleeding. The glow twisted and flickered, like something alive. Sumaya stopped, her breath hitching. "Why are they glowing now?" Jamal reached out, running his fingers over one of the symbols. The moment he touched it, the whispering returned. Louder, angrier. The cavern trembled. From the depths of the tunnel ahead, something shifted. A long, inhuman groan echoed toward them, the sound slithering into their bones. The temperature plummeted, their breath turning to mist in the air. Ihsan's grip on Dunya tightened. "We need to keep moving." Rayon took the lead, stepping into the tunnel. The others followed, their footsteps muffled by the damp ground. The deeper they went, the worse the symbols became. They were no longer just carvings. They were moving. The figures in stone twisted as they walked, contorting their faces into agony. Eyes appeared in places where no eyes had ever been before. They followed the every step that they took. Then, there was a parting of two tunnels. The one was steep and narrow, going down into blacker darkness still. The other was wider. But from the direction of that came a reek, sickening as to rotting flesh. Rayon breathed out slowly, wiping his forehead on a cloth. "Which way?" Lena pointed to the wider path. "That smell? We shouldn't go that way." Jamal glanced toward the narrow tunnel. "But down means deeper into this nightmare." Dunya whimpered. "We're trapped either way." Before they could decide, a sudden scream split the air. Not one of theirs. Something else. Something close. A shadow lunged from the wider path. The forgotten one. It was fast. Too fast. A blur of motion, impossibly thin, with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. It crawled toward them on all fours, its movements jerky, wrong, its mouth stretched into a soundless wail. Sumaya shrieked. "Run!" The group bolted, darting down the narrow path. The creature pursued, its bony limbs clicking against the stone, its hollow eyes gleaming with hunger. Rayon's heart pounded. The tunnel was too tight, too claustrophobic, the air pressing in on them. The ground sloped downward, making every step dangerous. Behind them, the thing shrieked, the sound splitting through the darkness. Jamal shouted, "Keep going! The tunnel twisted sharply, and suddenly, a drop. Rayan skidded to a halt, nearly falling into the pit before him. The tunnel ended abruptly, opening into a vast chamber below. But the others couldn't halt in time. Ehsan plowed into Rayan. Dunya tripped forward, and one by one they fell once more, into the unknown. They hit hard, air knocked from their lungs. The cavern into which they tumbled is massive, an ancient temple, its ceiling lost in shadow. Torches burned with an unnatural red fire, casting grotesque shadows against the walls. But the worst part, the altar in the center. Carved from black stone, it was covered in dried blood, and at its base lay rows of human skulls, their empty sockets staring. The moment they looked at it, the whispering stopped. Silence. A dreadful, suffocating silence. Then, a single voice broke through. Deep, ancient, waiting. You have come. The group froze. Rayan's flashlight flickered, the beam shaking in his trembling hand. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward. Not the Watcher, something older. Its form was wrapped in tattered crimson robes, its face hidden behind a mask of bone. It raised a hand, its fingers long and skeletal. The torches flared, the doors slammed shut, and in the distance from the tunnels above, the sound of many things crawling, coming, for them. The doors slammed shut, sealing them inside. Rayan's gasping breath made the air enter his lungs unevenly as the light from his flashlight struggled and jerked due to the choke of darkness surrounding him. He was standing alongside the robed figure that hid its face with an antique bone mask. The red gleam of torches cast unhealthy illumination in that room, letting the jagged shadows move. Who are you? Jamal went ahead, keeping his voice under a whisper. The figure tilted its head slowly, its fingers curling like withered roots. You have come, it repeated, its voice hollow and ancient, echoing through the cavern like a dying breath. As it was foretold. The whispering returned. But now, it wasn't just in their ears, it was inside their minds. Lena clutched her head, whimpering. Make it stop, please. Ehsan's voice trembled. We have to get out of here. Rayan's eyes darted across the temple of blood, searching for an exit. No doors, no tunnels, just the altar, the skulls, and something behind the figure. A stone slab, covered in the same pulsating red symbols that had followed them through the ruins. Only now they weren't just glowing. They were shifting, twisting, alive. Dunya took a step back. It's watching us. Rayan turned his flashlight toward the symbols, and for a moment, they formed an eye. A single monstrous eye staring straight into his soul. His grip on the flashlight tightened. We have to destroy it. The robed figure moved, not walked, glided like it had no weight, its presence distorting the air around it. You do not understand, it murmured. You were always meant to be here, to awaken it. Jamal gritted his teeth. We're not waking anything. We just want to leave. The figure let out a dry, rasping laugh. You already have. Then the ground trembled. A deep, guttural roar erupted from beneath them, shaking the temple walls. The altar cracked, ancient dust rising in a thick cloud. From the fractures, something black oozed out, thick and tar-like, pulsating as it spread across the floor. It smelled of death, and it was moving toward them. The symbols on the walls flared, their glow turning from red to deep, hungry black. The robed figure stepped aside, its bony fingers pointing toward the altar. It has awakened. A hand emerged from the oozing darkness, long, skeletal, twisted, then another, and another, until a mass of writhing limbs pulled itself from the pit. Sumaya screamed. The thing that rose from the altar had no true form, just shifting flesh, bone, and shadow, its many mouths whispering in voices that were both human and inhuman. Its eyes, hundreds of them, blinked in eerie synchronization, locking onto them with a hunger older than time. And then it moved. Rayan reacted first, grabbing Dunya and pulling her away from the spreading black mass. "Run!" The others stumbled back, their eyes locked on the nightmare unfolding before them. The torches flickered wildly, the air thickening like tar, making it harder to breathe. The robed figure watched in silence, as if this was always meant to happen. The creature's many arms shot forward, grasping at the air. One nearly caught Lena, its claws missing her by inches as she dove away. Jamal grabbed a fallen skull and hurled it at the beast. It shattered on impact, but the creature didn't even react. Ehsan's voice was raw with terror. "Nothing can stop it." Rayan turned to the stone slab. The shifting symbols. The eye. His instincts screamed that this was the key. He sprinted toward it. Wasim grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" Rayan's voice was firm. "Ending this." He didn't know how, but the slab was connected to whatever they had unleashed. The symbols had been waiting, watching, calling to them. If this thing had awakened because of it, then maybe, just maybe, he could stop it. He lifted his flashlight and smashed it against the slab. Nothing. The thing lunged, its massive shifting limbs reaching for him. Rayan slammed his fists against the stone. "Break, damn it!" Then, a voice, not the creature's, not the robed figure's, whispered in his mind. "Blood." His eyes widened. It wanted blood. Without hesitation, Rayan grabbed a shard of his broken flashlight and slashed his palm open. His blood dripped onto the stone slab, and the world exploded. A deafening roar ripped through the temple as the symbols blazed brighter than ever. The eye in the stone snapped shut, and the creature let out a horrific shriek, its form collapsing inward, limbs twisting as if being pulled into itself. The robed figure screamed. The temple walls cracked. The altar crumbled. The torches died. Then, silence. Rayan lay there on the cold floor, his eyes swimming. His hand still oozed blood. But on that stone slab, the symbols were gone. The altar was no more than rubble, and the creature, invisible. His friends were scattered about him, coughing, shaking, but alive. Jamal groaned. "What in hell just happened?" Ehsan shoved himself up. "Did we stop it?" Rayan opened his aching head and looked around. "I think so." The robed figure was nowhere. The whispering was silent. For the first time since they had arrived, the air felt normal. The ancient, suffocating presence was no longer watching them. Then, a low rumble shook the ground beneath them. Cracks spiderwebbed across the walls. Dust rained from above. The temple was collapsing. Wasim pulled Dunya to her feet. "We have to move, now!" They ran. Rubble fell all around them as they stumbled through the ruins, searching for an exit. The only path left was the tunnel they had fallen from, but it had changed. A faint light shone at the end. Daylight. Lena gasped. "It's open!" One by one, they scrambled up the collapsing tunnel, their hands bleeding from gripping the jagged stone. Behind them, the temple caved in, a final roar of stone and dust swallowing the horrors below. Rayan was the last to climb out, dragging himself onto the surface just as the entrance sealed behind him. Silence. The forgotten realm was gone. They lay there, gasping for breath, the cool air of the outside world filling their lungs. The night sky stretched above them, the moon no longer blood-red, but pale and distant. They had survived. But as Rayan looked back at the sealed ruins, a single thought chilled him to the bone. Had they truly ended it? Or had they just set it free? The cold night air wrapped around them as they lay sprawled on the damp forest floor, gasping for breath. The forgotten realm was no more. The temple had collapsed, swallowing its horrors beneath ancient stone. Yet something still felt wrong. Rayan clutched his bleeding hand, watching as the last traces of dust settled. The moon, once drenched in crimson, hung pale and distant in the sky. A sense of relief should have filled him, but a deep unease gnawed at his chest. Something had escaped. Jamal sat up, rubbing his temples. "Tell me that's it. Tell me it's over." No one answered. Dunya shivered, hugging herself. "I can still hear it." Ehsan frowned. "Hear what?" She swallowed hard, her voice a fragile whisper. The whispering. Rayyan's heart stopped. "We sealed the temple," Lena said, her voice firm but edged with uncertainty. "Whatever was in there, it's gone." But Dunya shook her head. "No." She pointed to the trees surrounding them. "It's here." They froze. The forest was no longer silent. A low murmur, not wind, not animals, slithered through the trees, twisting between the branches like a living thing. Shadows shifted in unnatural ways, stretching, bending, watching. Rayyan slowly stood. "We need to move." Wasim scanned the tree line. "Which way?" That's when they saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the forest, tall, motionless, wrapped in tattered black robes. A mask of bone covered its face, the same figure from the temple. Jamal's breath hitched. "How?" The figure raised a hand, a single gnarled finger, pointing directly at Rayyan. And then it spoke. "The gate is open." A sudden piercing scream erupted from the woods. Not human, not animal. Something else. Then, the trees moved, the branches twisted, contorting into skeletal fingers. The roots beneath their feet writhed, breaking through the soil like grasping hands. A howling wind tore through the clearing, but it carried no chill, only a sense of malice. And from the darkness, they came. Figures, dozens of them, emerging from the trees. Some were crawling, others dragging themselves across the ground. Their skin was stretched and torn, faces featureless, their bodies shifting unnaturally, as if they had forgotten how to be human. Sumaya choked back a sob. They were in the temple. Rayyan grabbed her hand. "Run!" They bolted. The forest turned into a blur of twisted branches and gnarled roots. The whispers became screams, growing louder, closer. Shadows darted between the trees, keeping pace. Rayyan's chest burned, his legs aching, but stopping meant death. Ahead, moonlight spilled onto an opening in the trees, a clearing. "There!" Ehsan shouted. They burst through the foliage, skidding to a stop, and froze. A stone monolith stood in the center of the clearing, covered in glowing red symbols, the same ones from the temple. But what sent ice through Rayyan's veins was what lay at its base. A mirror, not broken, not old, but perfectly intact. And in its reflection, they were still in the temple. Their reflections stood inside the ruined chamber, the bloodied altar still whole, the monstrous entity still rising. A hand, long, skeletal, pressed against the glass from the other side. Rayyan stumbled back. "What the hell is this?" The whispers grew deafening. The shadows in the woods crept closer, their twisted figures trembling in anticipation. Jamal gritted his teeth. "We should break it." Dunya's voice wavered. "What if breaking it makes things worse?" Rayyan had no answer. Then, the figure in black stepped into the clearing. Its voice was calm, patient. "You were never meant to leave." The ground split open, tendrils of black smoke curling from the cracks. The mirror trembled, the red symbols pulsing, a heartbeat of something alive. Rayyan understood now. The forgotten realm hadn't vanished. They had just been pushed into another layer of its nightmare, and the mirror was the only way back. Lena gripped his arm. "Rayyan, what do we do?" He looked at the robed figure. "What happens if we go through?" The masked head tilted. "You will finish what you started." Rayyan glanced at his friends, Jamal, Dunya, Ehsan, Wasim, Sumaya, Lena. Their faces were pale, their eyes filled with fear. But they all knew the truth. If they ran, the creatures would never stop hunting them. If they stayed, they would be swallowed by the darkness. Rayan clenched his fists. He stepped toward the mirror. His reflection moved with him, trapped in the world they had left behind. He lifted his bleeding palm, the blood from the temple sacrifice still fresh, and pressed it against the glass. The whispers stopped. The forest vanished, and the bloodied moon burned red once more. A heavy silence fell over the ruined temple as Rayan stood before the shattered mirror, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The silver glass had liquefied, its shards melting into the ground like spilled mercury, seeping into the cracks of the ancient stone floor. But the reflection remained. He could still see himself, standing inside the mirror, untouched by the destruction. His own face stared back at him, but the eyes weren't his. They were black voids, deep and endless. The mirror version of himself grinned, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, as if the thing inside had only been wearing his face as a mask. Rayan stepped back, but the mirrored version didn't. It stepped forward. The glass rippled like water. And then, a hand burst through. Pale, twisted fingers, longer than they should have been, clawed at the air. The flesh was stretched too thin over the bones, the nails jagged and blackened. The hand flexed, reaching toward Rayan. His pulse roared in his ears. He wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to escape. But his body refused to obey. He was rooted to the spot, his limbs heavy as if chains had wrapped around him, holding him in place. Then a sound from the well of the mirror, slow, raspy, inhuman. Rayan's vision blurred. The world around him faded, the temple walls dissolving into shadow. The voices of his friends, Jamal, Dunya, Ehsan, Wasim, Sumaya, Lena, became distant echoes, as if they were being pulled away from him. He could still see them. They were frozen in place, their eyes locked on the mirror, their faces twisted in terror. And then, the thing in the mirror spoke, not with words, not with sound, but directly into his mind. "Come closer." Rayan's legs moved on their own. His body obeyed, against his will. His feet dragged forward, closer to the mirror's gaping void. "Come home." A force wrapped around his chest, pulling him forward. The mirror wanted him. It swallowed him whole to try to encompass him. Rayan fell. The instant he crossed the doorstep, he felt himself be drawn into the blackness. He was blasted through by a glacial wind screeching above his head. He fell without end, bellowing hoarsely down the well-like void. Shades danced about his head, talking in languages that made no sense to him. And then, he landed with a crash. A dull crack came through his skull, anguish exploding right behind his eyes. He took a gasping breath, the air thick with the scent of blood and rot. He pushed himself up, and stopped. He wasn't in the ruined temple anymore. He was in a chamber, vast, ancient, and impossibly tall. The walls were carved from blackened stone, flickering torches casting deep shadows across the grotesque reliefs etched into their surfaces. Figures knelt in a circle around him, their heads bowed, their hands bound in golden chains that pulsed with an eerie light. Their faces were missing, only empty, hollow voids remained where their features should have been. A single throne stood at the end of the chamber. It was made of bone, and on it sat a figure draped in crimson robes. The figure's face was hidden behind a grinning skull mask, the eye sockets filled with absolute darkness. It did not move, yet Rayan felt it watching him. Then the voice came, not from the figure, not from the kneeling worshippers, but from everywhere. "The gate has been opened." Rayan's pulse pounded. The ritual has begun. The ground beneath him shifted, symbols burning into the stone, glowing deep red. A sound, low, rumbling, rose from the depths of the chamber. It started as a whisper, then grew into a chant. The kneeling figures lifted their hands, their hollow faces turned toward the throne. Rayan turned sharply. The mirror was still there, but the reflection had changed. It no longer showed the temple. It showed his friends, still frozen on the other side, their expressions twisted in horror as they watched him. And standing behind them were their reflections, twisted, distorted, wrong. Their eyes were empty pits. Their mouths were too wide, stretching into sickening grins that revealed rows of jagged, broken teeth. And then, they moved. The reflections stepped forward, their hands reaching for the real versions. Dunya was the first to scream, "No! Get away from me!" She tried to move, but her reflection grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward the glass. Jamal turned, his voice raw with terror. "Rayan, do something!" The throne-bound figure stood. "It is already done." Rayan's breath hitched. He couldn't let this happen. He had to break the ritual. His eyes darted around the chamber. The golden chains, the kneeling figures, the symbols glowing beneath him. And then, he understood. The chains weren't binding the worshippers. They were sealing something in. Rayan lunged. With all his strength, he gripped one of the golden chains and yanked. The moment it snapped, the entire chamber shook. The kneeling figures let out a piercing wail, their hollow faces cracking apart as if they were made of brittle stone. The throne-bound figure screamed. The mirror shattered. The reflections exploded into mist, their twisted forms dissolving into nothingness. And then, the world collapsed. Rayan's eyes snapped open. He was lying on the forest floor, gasping for breath. The cold air stung his lungs, the scent of damp earth grounding him back to reality. He turned his head. Jamal, Dunya, Ehsan, Wasim, Sumaya, Lena, they were all there, alive. The temple was gone. The forest was silent. The bloodied moon above them had returned to its normal shade. Rayan sat up, his mind spinning. "Did we win?" Wasim whispered. No one answered. And then, a gust of wind swept through the trees, carrying a single, whispered word. "For now." The forest was deathly silent. Rayan's breath came in shallow gasps as he sat on the cold, damp ground, staring up at the pale moon, its crimson hue finally gone. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, but the whisper from the wind still echoed in his mind. "For now." The others stirred around him. Dunya clutched her arms, her face pale, her lips moving wordlessly as if trying to convince herself this was real. Wasim and Ehsan exchanged nervous glances, their bodies tense, ready to run if necessary. Jamal rubbed his temples, his expression filled with exhaustion and fear. None of them spoke for several moments. Then Dunya broke the silence. We're alive," she whispered, but her voice held no relief. Only dread. Rayan swallowed hard and forced himself to stand, his muscles aching from the ordeal. He turned in slow circles, scanning the forest, searching for any sign of the temple, the mirror, or the throne-bound figure. But there was nothing. The ruins were gone. Not one piece of that old stone remains, nor fragment of those gilded chains, nor a cracked piece of that accursed mirror. It's as if nothing was ever here at all, except the mark on the ground, a charred symbol written in the soil, still burning with a sulfurous red fire. Rayan's stomach knotted. He didn't recognize the shape, but something deep inside him knew it was wrong, like a scar burned into the very fabric of reality. "It's over," Jamal said, but no one believed him. The moment he spoke those words, the wind picked up again, whispering through the trees. The branches above them swayed, casting shifting shadows across the forest floor. Then, something moved. A shadow, barely visible among the trees. It wasn't human. Lena gasped. "Did you see that?" Rayan turned sharply, but whatever had been there was gone. The others had seen it too. The way their eyes darted frantically into the darkness made it clear they were not imagining things. Asan grabbed Rayyan's arm. His grip was ice cold. "We need to go. Now." Rayyan nodded, not needing any further convincing. Whatever was left in this forest was not meant to be faced. They turned toward the path leading out of the woods, their steps hurried, their breaths short. But as they moved, the forest changed. The trees twisted, their bark forming grotesque shapes, faces screaming silently from their gnarled trunks. The ground shifted beneath their feet, as though something massive slumbered beneath the surface. And the whispers grew louder. "You cannot leave." Rayyan's blood turned to ice. Jamal cursed under his breath. Dunya clamped her hands over her ears, trying to shut out the voices, but it was inside their heads now, crawling through their minds like 1,000 unseen fingers. "You opened the gate." The ground shuddered. A tremor rippled through the earth, and then they heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from everywhere. Then, from the shadows, they emerged. Figures. Twisted and elongated, their bodies stretched unnaturally tall, their limbs too long, their fingers ending in sharpened claws. Their eyes were black voids, just like the ones from the mirror. They were the same figures from the carvings in the temple. Rayyan's chest tightened. "They're real," Sumaya whispered in horror. The creatures began to move, their steps unnervingly silent despite their size. Their heads twitched unnaturally, their mouths opening in wide, impossible grins that revealed jagged teeth dripping with something dark. "You cannot run." Rayyan's mind screamed at him to move, but his legs refused. His entire body was paralyzed by terror. Then Dunya grabbed his hand and yanked him forward. "Run!" she shrieked. The spell broke, and they all bolted. Their feet pounded against the earth as they sprinted through the trees, their breaths ragged, their limbs burning with exertion. The creatures followed, their movements unnaturally fast, shifting between the trees like shadows. The edge of the forest was close. Rayyan could see the dim glow of village lights beyond the trees. If they could just... A scream shattered the night. "Wasim!" Rayyan turned, his heart stopping cold. One of the creatures had caught him, its clawed hand wrapped around his throat, lifting him off the ground. His feet kicked desperately as he choked, his fingers clawing at the air. "Wasim!" Dunya cried. Jamal grabbed a rock and hurled it at the creature. The stone struck its head, but it didn't even flinch. Rayyan felt something shift inside him, an urge, a voice in his head, whispering instructions. He didn't know why he did it, but his hands moved on their own. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, golden fragment, the piece of the chain he had broken back in the temple. It still glowed faintly. Instinct took over. Rayyan lunged forward, slamming the golden fragment into the creature's chest. A piercing screech erupted from the beast as it convulsed violently, its form flickering like a distorted image. Its grip on Wasim loosened, and the moment he fell to the ground, the creature collapsed into black mist, vanishing with a final guttural snarl. Silence. Rayyan's hands trembled. The remaining creatures had stopped moving, their void-like eyes fixed on the golden fragment in his hands. And then, they retreated. One by one, they melted back into the shadows, disappearing into the depths of the forest. The whispers faded. The ground stilled. It was over. Rayyan helped Wasim to his feet, his body still shaking. Dunya wiped her face, trying to catch her breath. Sumaya clutched her chest, her eyes wide with disbelief. They stumbled out of the forest, emerging into the safety of the village road. Behind them, the trees stood tall and silent, as if nothing had ever happened. But Rayyan knew. He could still feel it. The forest wasn't gone. The creatures weren't defeated. They were simply waiting, watching. And one day, the bloodied moon would rise again. Rayyan turned to the others, his voice steady but firm. "We can't let this happen again." Jamal exhaled sharply. So what do we do? Rayan stared back at the forest, the golden fragment still warm in his hands. We prepare. Because this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The wind whispered through the trees as Rayan stood at the edge of the forest, the golden fragment still clenched tightly in his hand. The village behind him was silent, its people unaware of the horrors that lurked beyond the trees. But he knew. He could still feel them watching. Dunya stepped up beside him, her face pale, her eyes haunted. Do you think they'll come back? Rayan didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on the darkness between the trees, where the shadows shifted unnaturally. The bloodied moon was gone, but the air still carried its stench of death. They never left, he said finally. Jamal, standing on his other side, let out a heavy breath. Then what do we do now? Rayan looked at them, his friends, his survivors, and knew there was no going back to normal life. Not after what they had seen, not after what they had unleashed. We learn, he said. We prepare. Dunya exhaled shakily, rubbing her arms as though trying to chase away the cold that had settled deep into her bones. Prepare for what, Rayan? Rayan's fingers tightened around the golden fragment. For when the moon turns red again. Wasim scoffed, his voice still hoarse from nearly being strangled by the creatures. So, what? We just wait? Hope they don't come back? No. Rayan turned to face them fully, his gaze sharp and unwavering. We stop them before they rise again. Silence hung heavy in the air. Sumaya, who had barely spoken since their escape, finally whispered, "And how do we do that?" Rayan hesitated. He didn't have all the answers. But something inside him, some deep-rooted instinct, told him that the mirror, the temple, and the chains were only part of the story. There must be more to this, he said. Someone, somewhere, must know what happened before. We need to find out how this all began. Jamal nodded slowly. You mean the Forgotten Realm? Rayan's pulse quickened at the name. The Cursed Land, the place whispered about in old folk tales, the land where kings had fallen, where sorcerers had vanished, where time itself twisted in unnatural ways, the land where this nightmare may have started. Ihsan shifted uneasily. You really think there's something out there? Something that can help us? Rayan met his gaze. I don't think. He swallowed hard. I know. Another breeze stirred the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of whispers. The creatures were still out there, lurking, waiting, and when the bloodied moon rose again, they would be ready. If this story sent chills down your spine and kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like this video to show your support for more spine-tingling horror stories. Comment below with your thoughts. What do you think happened next? Should the story continue? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying new tale. The bloodied moon may have set, but the darkness is far from over. Stay tuned for more horror that will haunt your nights.